Lovely. Good evening, everyone. For the 67th Strand Group event, I'm the director, John Davis. Before we begin our exceptional panel, we're just going to play you a very short video about our new Masters programme. Please tell the world we are doing our best. Martin. The MA in Government Studies at King's College London offers an unrivalled opportunity to get an insider's view as to how government really works.
The truth is, as I know, if you're a cabinet minister, if you're an advisor of the Treasury, it's not about textbooks and equations. It's not simply about being able to study the past. It's about understanding what's happening in complex ways, learning from the past, and then saying, on that basis, what is the right way forward in that decision for our country.
So we look at policy, what the government of the day is doing and why they're doing it. We also look at process, so how the decision-making is happening, the machinery of government, and then we look at personality, so who are the individuals, what shaped them as people, how do they get on.
This MA programme has institutional partnerships with organisations like Number 10 Downing Street and the Treasury. What that means is that classes can take place in buildings like Number 10 Downing Street and the Treasury, but it also means that we have the highest profile guest practitioners come into the classroom and teach alongside our academics to give you an experience of how government really works in practice.
We are really trying to create a very dynamic learning environment. It's in person. You're going to be part of a small cohort, so you really get to know each other, you'll get to know us, and we're excited to be able to leverage our proximity to the heart of government.
The calibre of people you're interacting with is like nothing else you'll ever do. Specific things like going to Downing Street, meeting ex-Prime Ministers, Chancellors, Senior Ministers, etc. But that's what King's does better than anybody else.
It really is the embodiment of knowledge with purpose.
Working really closely with the Treasury, we've had a good 250 different Treasury civil servants come and do our class as part of their job. The Treasury thinks that its current civil servants can learn skills and learn from history in our class.
Our students, having studied British government, find that it's very useful for going into British government. We have students who go on to serve in the civil service or to get involved in politics more directly, in business, in government relations, in public policy, in think tanks and in journalism. Ultimately, you're learning a set of skills here that are transferable.
I've got to say, I'd love to have done this class when I was in my 20s. I think it would have really helped me. You see a complete picture of public policy, and we use the lens of history to help us understand the challenges we face today and in the future. I think these are brilliant skills which any politician, policymaker can learn in this class and would really equip them to go on and do those kind of jobs in the future.
Well, there we are. I didn't know that we were playing that, but that's very exciting. And this is the Masters course kicks off, I think, in September. There's a number of studentships available. And part of that is the work that I've been involved in with John and Nick McPherson now for 9 years, teaching that class about the Treasury and economic policy since 1945. And we talk about economic analysis, but also the historical experience, and that's about people and institutions and how they work together, and then we use them to get people thinking about current problems and challenges for the future. And in a way, the project we've been working on for the last 3 years, and which we're talking about the final paper of today, is an example of that, because our first paper was about economics, our second paper, a very big contemporary history project, and on this panel, John Kingman, Michael Gove and Tom Redden are all interviewees amongst the 95 plus people that we interviewed, people who were involved in policy making back then. And what we've done in this paper is decide to look to the future. I'm going to introduce the panel in a moment, and we're going to have a discussion amongst ourselves about the way forward, and then open it up to discussion with you before we go to drinks. But before we do that, I'm going to ask my co-authors to give you a presentation of the recommendations of our paper. They are Nyasha Weinberg, who was with me at the Kennedy School a few years back and is now a barrister. Dan Turner, who's currently the advisor to the Mayor of South Yorkshire, former biz civil servant, Kennedy School, also about to make a new career move. And Esme Elsden, who is a PhD student actually at UCL, The three of them are all here tonight. And then the fourth co-author of ours isn't here, Anna Stansbury. She is a new professor at MIT, a British economist out there. And so I think Nyasha and Dan are going to walk us through the recommendations, and then I'm going to open it up to a discussion up here on the top table. And we're going to talk about, I think, in two stages. First of all, what is the right way to go about shaping policy to tackle the challenges which we're talking about. And then secondly, to talk about the politics and institutional deliverability of change in the next Parliament. So over to you, Nyasha, and to Dan. And huge thanks to John Davis and Martin and all the King's team for making tonight possible. Also the Gatsby Foundation and Harvard for their financial support. And for all of you for coming along to be part of this discussion this evening. It's very much appreciated.
Thank you very much, Ed. Really happy to introduce you all this evening to the launch of our paper, A Growth Policy to Close Britain's Regional Divides, What Needs to be Done. So the background to all of this is a very simple fact. UK regional policy hasn't worked. UK regional inequality has grown despite decades of policy effort. It stagnated over the past 18 years. The gap between South East England and the rest of the UK is now bigger than that between East and West Germany or North and South Italy. Britain has huge geographic inequalities in economic outcomes, health, education and social mobility. Underperformance of the UK's cities and regions is holding us back. Closing the gap could raise GVA by at least £55 billion per year. The UK's national productivity and regional productivity challenges are linked. Tackling stagnant growth and low regional productivity is now a cross-party imperative. Well, what gives us the authority to say all of this? Our first two papers provide most of our evidence base. Our first paper, written with Anna Stansbury, was an econometric analysis of the UK's binding constraint. That paper found as follows. Education. We've moved from too few graduates in the 1990s to too few STEM-trained scientists today. On infrastructure, there's been too little transport investment, especially in lower productivity regions. On innovation, public support for innovation currently amplifies rather than corrects for regional inequality. Money doesn't go to the regions that need it most. On finance, there's been too little equity investment outside London. And in respect of housing, high housing costs in London is preventing regional convergence through migration. Our conclusion is that there is a new growth model for the UK, but only if we pull the right levers. Our second paper was based on interviews that we conducted with 93 politicians and practitioners, including 3 prime ministers and 6 chancellors. And from those prime ministers and mayors to Whitehall growth specialists, our interviewees told us what we can learn from the regional growth policy that did take place in the years from 1979 to 2015. We went through those interviews, all of which are available online with the interview transcripts published in full, and identified a broad consensus amongst decision makers. They found that politics in the 80s and 90s drove centralisation and helped to maintain that centralisation afterwards. Those who were responsible for regional policy regret not doing more earlier during their time in government. Centralisation, in turn, has enabled short-term decision-making and policy chop and change, which has undermined policies that work. The mayoral combined authorities in England are reducing policy churn, and there's broadly agreement that they're really working, but more needs to be done, and they are not universally spread across the UK. Change is possible, but given our starting point, one of the most centralised states in the OECD, it needs to be driven by the top. This paper is our third paper in the series, and what we do in our paper is set out the recommendations. We aim to give the answers to the questions which those that we interviewed said that they couldn't agree on. First, what are the most important policy levers for growth in the regions and nations, and what's the right level for making decisions about those levers? Second, where decentralisation is part of the answer, what model should we adopt for decentralisation? How much should Whitehall drive institutional reform in order to make any map of the UK comprehensive? And how do we fund a more decentralised government to balance equity with incentives? In conclusion, what do we need to do to create political consensus behind regional growth policy? And to answer all those questions, I'm going to hand over to my co-author, Dan.
Great, so I get the easy questions. Good evening, everybody. Lovely to see so many familiar faces. Sorry if you can't see me in that corner. I'm going to rattle through our 10-point plan, well-rounded, in order to answer those 4 questions that Nyash has set out. And then we'll hand over to the panel and you can tell us what you agree with, what you disagree with, how you might nuance any suggestions. So first of all, we think that the UK needs to develop a national growth and productivity strategy and stick with it. We've had a cycle of national strategies over the past few years. So what would make this one different? We think it needs to be owned by the centre of government, co-designed with the regions, delivered as far away from central government and as close to the communities that it will affect as possible, and set out a long-term vision that all parties, all parts of government, all stakeholders that would need to be involved in delivering this can sign up to. So it has that longevity across different ministerial portfolios, political cycles, and into an investment cycle. We have our own view of what that plan should contain, as Nyash has already set out, and some specific recommendations in the report around investing more in local and regional transport networks to try and increase the density, effective density of our city regions in particular, investing in the innovation assets that are relatively well spread across the country, helping connect them more directly into regional economies through things like regional equity investment funds, more support for the Catapult network or the Strength in Places Fund in Innovate UK. Doing more on skills to bring to life the emerging architecture around regional skills planning, the toolkits that are available to mayors and local skill provisioners in order to meet specific local gaps in labour markets. And then finally, reforming the planning system, a hot button topic at the moment, but looking to do more to have a region-wide view of strategic economic infrastructure that brings together energy systems, transport systems, housing targets, linking that into local plans, and then asking if there's more we can do with mayors or their equivalents, first ministers, to have London mayoral style powers to call in particular planning decisions. Now, this isn't to say that everything should go to the mayoral combined authority level, far from it. And we think that the role of local authorities is, if anything, significantly underplayed at the moment, underappreciated, under-recognised. So we really want to stress the role of local authorities in supporting civic infrastructure, in supporting social infrastructure, in supporting universal basic infrastructure across all parts of the country, and their role as place leaders in joining up public services, whether that's at a local level, regional level, national level, for their communities. But how do we do this, and what's that model that we think we ought to be working towards? Our view is that there needs to be a consistent sub-regional tier of government across the whole of the UK. So as well as devolved governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, extending the sub-regional model from the urban areas and some of the non-urban areas where it exists at the moment across the rest of England. We don't think that we need to be prescriptive about this. We think that there's more complexity in the current arrangement than sometimes we give credit for. We have the London mayoral model, we have the First Ministers and devolved parliaments in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. But what we do think we need to see are a comprehensive tier that meets these 6 criteria. So it's at a sufficient scale that it's driving scale economies, it's helping overcome parochial political interests that may get in the way of a wider regional or local interest. It's sufficiently accountable, And that's not just accountable up to Whitehall, that's accountable within its community to residents through things like local media, as well as your more formal political scrutiny mechanisms. And it has a single point of contact. So we're kind of open to the debate on what this looks like, whether that has to be an elected mayor, but we think you need a strong leader with a region-wide mandate in order to be able to drive a region-wide political agenda. Now, having said that, we recognise that the current approach, which relies heavily on voluntarism, bottom-up initiative, is leading to inequities in how England especially is governed, in our view. So we've ended up in a situation where some places feel left out because, or certainly some residents and particular communities feel left out because potentially their politicians can't negotiate a deal, they're not high up enough the list or able to negotiate for their interests locally. So in order to make sure that resources are fairly distributed across the UK, in order to ensure that all communities feel like they have a stake in the emerging new constitutional arrangements within England, we think we need a comprehensive structure. And that might mean moving beyond the current bottom-up voluntaristic approach towards a firmer steer from Whitehall that we need mayors everywhere, and we will institute a process, or say mayors, we need sub-regional authorities with a leader everywhere, and we will set up a process in order to deliver that. So far, we've really just spoken about the institutional architecture of local authorities and the regional tier, but just as important is saying Whitehall needs to change. Its structures, its culture, its politics needs to adjust to this new reality of regional authorities everywhere and in the devolved nations as well. So that's why we proposed a regional growth delivery unit within central government, chaired by the Prime Minister, and driving through the change that's set out in the National Growth Plan through the architecture of Whitehall. So in our mind, what this looks like is every budget, there is a clear, published, transparent account of the government's progress against its targets. The sunlight being the best disinfectant, we can say which parts of Whitehall are struggling, which parts of Whitehall are not delivering as much as we expected. And they can be held to account accordingly. And perhaps most pertinently, given our findings in the second paper about the importance of political leadership in driving this change, if you think as a cabinet minister that your next promotion or your job depends on being in the good books of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, and they're telling you the way you meet that goal is by delivering your regional objectives, we think it will start to shift some of these vested interests within the central state. But just to make that happen, we have another recommendation, which is bringing mayors and first ministers into the legislature so that they too can hold central government to account. And then the sticky question of how do you fund all of this? We don't think that there are easy answers to this. And ultimately, we think that in order to address the deep-lying inequities or deep-seated inequities in the UK's regional inequalities will take time, will take significant investment. And we recognise that in the current fiscal climate, that's a difficult ambition for some people. But there are some short-term fixes that you could make that would make a significant difference. One being expanding the single pot of mayors. So in Greater Manchester and the West Midlands, the government has moved towards giving bundles or bundling up funding streams that currently sit in Whitehall to local leaders so they can drive better efficiencies across those policy areas and make more effective use of the resources that we currently already have. We think that that should be rolled out to other regions and should include a wider range of funding sources as well. We get into this in the paper, but we think that there's a case for looking more to devolve innovation funding, employment support, retrofit, and a few other nationally held pots at the moment. We think that local government, and you can nuance this to say reform local government if you're of the view that we need to help drive and incentivise local government reform through this process as well, should be offered a multi-year spending settlement. So if you're in local government, you can spend now and invest in an intervention that will drive public service reform over, say, a 5 or 10-year time horizon, so you can make the preventative investments that we hear so much about at the moment. And then finally, we think, as I said earlier, that there's a strong case for reallocating capital spending away from London and the South East and towards the other regions of the UK. Within that, in order to make it work, we think you would have to look at the mechanics of how we allocate funding in UK government. So looking at the Treasury Green Book, the principles that are used to allocate funds, and whether we want to move towards alternative ways of assessing cost-benefit ratios, and so on. And then finally, that's our Blue Peter, here's 10 recommendations we came up with earlier, but that won't work for many of the political stakeholders who need to be on board in order for this to stick, which was one of the findings of our second paper. We need a set of policies that can be agreed now that can have 10, 15, 20 years to bed in across political cycles. So more than anything, what we call for is a process starting now, starting in the conversations around manifestos, in as cross-party a way as you can do in a highly contested national political environment, to say, this is what we need to do as a country, this is how we get a grip, this is how we don't find ourselves in 20 years' time talking to a bunch of Harvard and KCL researchers saying, I wish I'd have done more when I was writing that manifesto in 2024. So we hope the government doesn't duck the challenge. Over to you, Ed.
Thank you to Dan. Now we've got a great panel to discuss this, and then we'll open it up to your questions. And the panel are John Kingman, first of all, who now a eminent kind of corporate chair, but was second permanent secretary in the Treasury, and let's be honest, failed with Gordon Brown to deliver rising regional productivity rates, and then failed with George Osborne to deliver rising regional productivity rates. So John did an interview with us where he reflects upon his collective failure. So we're interested to know whether he thinks this would make any difference. And then we have Rachel Wolfe, founding partner of Public First, author of the last Conservative Manifesto, close colleague of Michael Gove within his rather more centralising phase earlier in the last decade at education. So does Rachel think there is potential here? Tom Reardon, former head of strategy, then chief executive at the Yorkshire Forward, the regional development agency, in the period where regions meant the old, large government office regions of the post-war map. But now one of the longest serving, most experienced chief executives in local government at Leeds City Council, but also very formative in setting up the Leeds or the West Yorkshire Combined Authority. Then we have Michael Gove, who is the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, but also have a huge experience in being part of a government earlier in the last decade when George Osborne and Greg Clark were pushing this agenda forward. So we're interested to know as well his reflections on that period. And he did an excellent interview with us where, there are, if you analyse it textually, you can see he really supports what we're talking about here. He just didn't quite say it overtly, but it's all there. And then we're also going to be joined by Alison McGovern, who's a Merseyside MP, Shadow Employment Secretary. She's a bit late because she has to vote. Quite why Michael's here, I've no idea, but we're not going to. And what I would like to do is, so I've given you a bit of a kind of tease in, but I think there's 10 recommendations. It's a big policy, political challenge, and I'm going to say, let's go round twice. And first of all, talk about if you want a policy for raising growth and raising regional growth rates in the UK, would you go for this model from a policy point of view? And then secondly, to ask, what is the politics of this for central government, for local authorities and combined authorities, for those places who are currently putting themselves outside of this world, like Leicester or Portsmouth and Southampton? Is this a deliverable vision? Is the idea that you might have a plan and then stick to it for more than 5 years, pie in the sky? So first of all, the policy model, and then secondly, the political institutional deliverability. And let's go down from here. So John, you're up first.
Thank you for your excellent introduction. I have failed a lot of things in my life, of which this is high up on the list. And
we failed together.
We did. And interestingly, under two very different chancellors and very different political persuasions. So what can you learn from that experience of double failure? I actually think there is something quite interesting. I mean, crudely, to caricature, the Gordon Brown, Ed Balls instalment of this policy was kind of all money, no devolution, crudely. And the George Osborne version was the precise opposite. It was all devolution, no money, actually more than no money, I mean savage public spending cuts at the same time in the places we're talking about. And I can try. Is that working?
Is that actually on?
I'm not sure it is.
Martin, you'll sort it out.
Is that, no?
Keep going and we'll sort it.
I'll try and talk louder.
All devolution, no money versus all money, no devolution.
No devolution. And so one conclusion that I draw from that experience is that you've got to do both. And one thing I like about this paper is it does set out an agenda for doing both. Oh, that works. Excellent. So that's good. But the other conclusion I draw from this, and let's face it, as the paper says, you are looking at a lot more than 50 years of policy failure here, with innumerable governments trying innumerable things, none of which has moved the dial. I do not draw the conclusion from that it's impossible to achieve massive turnarounds of particularly big cities. There are plenty of examples in the United States, and there are quite a few in Europe, and we have failed to achieve any of those turnarounds. And I think one thing we should be clear about is that fiddling around the edges is not going to work. And so what I like about the paper is that I think directionally it's headed absolutely in the right course, but I question whether it is bold enough. And I will just give you 3 examples where I think it might not be. I mean, first of all, I think the paper is a bit coy, that you were just going to need a ton of money and a serious financial base. Now, we can come on to how realistic it is to achieve that, but realistically, if you look at places where this has happened, you have had a ton of investment, and I would be bolder about fiscal devolution in particular, which you shy away from. Similarly, I think there's a sort of serious attack of the Sir Humphreys in the paper when it gets to the single pot, which you say actually can only be spent within very strict Whitehall guidelines. So the man from Whitehall still knows best in the world of this paper, and I question whether that is right. And finally, planning policy, an area that I think is very important here. What the paper does is it fixes a fundamental flaw in the George Osborne mayoral models, which I can come and can talk about the reasons why this was done, but subjects planning, local plans in mayoral areas to a unanimity of all the local authorities, and it fixes that problem, which would be a really good thing. But it leaves cities with mayors still subject to masses and masses and masses of national planning policy and subject to call-ins by the Secretary of State. And we've got the Secretary of State here, and he's a very good man. But is he the man to decide, for example, the right use of a shop in Oxford Street? A decision he took recently. I would suggest that's a decision best taken by the mayor, the elected mayor of London. So I think a political scientist who looked at your paper and said, if you did all of the things in this paper, I suggest we would still, even then, be an international outlier. We would still be a very centralised country by international standards, and I think you might have to go further.
The only thing is, though, just on the resources question,
Yep.
There is clearly a question about how much you spend. You know, we underspend on local city transport, we underspend on innovation compared to other countries. That isn't the same as saying you should raise the money locally. That's a different thing.
I agree, but I would do both. And I think that it's perfectly possible to do both. And I think one of the reasons is to give the elected politicians in these cities a very strong economic interest in the revenue base and therefore the economic success of the city.
Cool. Rachel.
Thank you. I was going to start with politics, but you told me not to, so I'll try and talk about the policy first and actually agree with a lot of what John said. So one of the things that comes out in this paper, and I think it's a fascinating and excellent paper, is that you are orienting local areas to Whitehall in a somewhat less unbearable way than they are oriented today. And that seems to me perfectly legitimate, but they're still entirely oriented to Whitehall, even to the degree that you think they should be spending lots of time in Westminster in the second chamber rather than in their own cities, because that's where influence lies. And it seems to me that if you want to be serious about changing regional gaps, you need to orient people towards their regions. And as John said, that includes giving them real skin in the game. That involves giving the population real skin in the game and giving them a true incentive to make their area work rather than ask for more redistribution in the next round. And I'm not convinced yet that this does that. So I would agree, I think it needs to be bolder. I'm also a little more hesitant than the paper, I think, John, about the perfect structural answer to devolution across the country. And that's partly an energy point. You know, this is just where you would dissipate a lot of your time and energy from Whitehall. But I suppose it also links to your mild jibe about education reform earlier, Ed, because I would say that...
I was a centraliser as well.
You were
so
absolutely
it was kind of
centralised.
I wasn't...
But at least one idea behind the sort of school reforms of the early 2010s, and indeed pre-2010s, was that they were tapping into latent desire and demand from the bottom up, in fact, well below the local authority level. And I think it is potentially much more productive to lean in very heavily into the clear areas of latent desire and demand, which is now emerging around some of the big cities, than to spend vast amounts of time persuading the Northeast that once said no to now say yes. So I think that there is a need for more skin in the game, which does include fiscal devolution, tax take, but I would also, on the flip side, be narrower. I think on policy, if I take one of your examples as a test, which is skills. So the thing that you absolutely identify in your first paper is that we have now got a lot of graduates, we have pretty good school standards, and we have a huge STEM technical gap. Would regional skills planning solve that gap? And I think when we already have a system that is, to a significant degree, employer-led now, and I think it would only credibly solve that gap if that region could, for example, choose to double the teaching grant for every STEM degree in the universities in their area, or fund every SME in any technical area to do apprenticeships aside from the current levy pot that's going into Whitehall. In other words, that it has both the quantum and the range of power possible to actually really quite significantly change what is funded and what is done. The final thing I'll say, and I don't think this is necessarily a problem, but I think it's worth discussing, is that what this paper doesn't do, which seems to me a very prevalent debate right now, is have any view about what the economy in these places should really be. And we've had in the last year a report from, say, the Resolution Foundation, which is broadly services is where it's at. And you're either a hairdresser or you trade services, probably in London and the South East. Maybe a bit of it will emerge in Manchester. And on the flip side, a set of government and potential opposition incentives, which are entirely designed towards driving up our industrial base. I think how you would devolve, how you would regionally plan, how you fund skills are very different depending on which of those you think are credible. Finally, I would say, however, I think there is some cause for optimism because this does seem to me one of the few areas where it is credible. There is some cross-party consensus, perhaps because it doesn't matter enough to the electorate to really cause major dividing lines, but that provides opportunity for change.
We'll come back to that. I've got a question to ask you, but I'm going to hold it for the second round. Tom.
Very keen to get into politics.
Exactly.
So yeah, I won't repeat what's been said. I guess by going for consensus, which is your main conclusion at the end, you've compromised on some of the boldness. It would be some of the answer to this. But let me go through each of the levels and start by saying that I think one of the things that the report says, which I think is easy to miss, is that actually the real key to this is a new collective endeavour between all three levels and an alignment between all three levels, which we've never had before. And my experience of COVID, when I and with Baroness Blake was trying to deal with that in Leeds, I went into the centre for 3 months and tried to build up the local bit of testing. And we actually managed in that period, in 6 weeks, to get every part of the country to have a local outbreak plan. We had £500 million from the government, and we got on and did it together. And I think it formed the basis of a good testing regime that emerged to allow the vaccine process to thrive. There were lots of other things that went horrendously difficult that I won't comment on, but that showed to me the opportunity if you got that alignment. Just going through the levels, the local level in here is quite interesting and I think is worth a read. The good thing about the report is that I think it does address that question of it's not funded properly. We're not funded to do the role that we've got at the moment at a local level. And if you try and deliver a growth plan, even if you tried to cut local government out of it, which you can't do in the end anyway, you've got to resource it properly to do the job you've been asking it to do. So whether it's A&E waiting times, or whether it's the parks of a place, or whether it's the planning system and the economic development and investors having confidence in a place, you've got to get that right. And that's got to be the foundation stone, actually, not the other way around. Because investors only invest in places where they're confident in that local leadership and they've got a plan and they're following it. So the local bit of this I like, and I like the idea of civic infrastructure and social infrastructure. I think it's much missed, and a lot of the objections that you get to housing are actually around that lack of provision that there is for GP surgeries or transport or flood defences. So that level, I would say, tick, and we need to sort out the role and reset the money around it. Secondly, the regional tier. I see, having done the regional role myself,
by regional, you don't mean the old.
I don't mean the old regions. I mean the
combined authorities.
The combined authorities. Yeah. So the conclusion is, let's go with what we've got. I think we've got the democratic element sorted. I totally agree with that. Let's not rip it up. Let's just go with it. However, one of the other things that happened with the RDAs was mission creep. And I think one of the things that Whitehall likes about the mayors is that there's fewer of them than local authority leaders. So they don't have to deal with as many. And it's a bit easier to understand the economic geography of the country. But if you live in the East Midlands, you know that Derby, Nottingham, Leicester, Leicestershire, all of that is, there's a polycentric nature to that. If you live in Yorkshire, you know that it's not, you can't just talk about West Yorkshire. You've got to talk about Leeds. You've got to think about Bradford, a big city right next door. And if you're in West Midlands, it's much of an urbanised conurbation that fits together well, but you've got real difference within that as well. And Greater Manchester, probably the most coherent urban geography that we've got and the biggest history of it. But all of that is different. And the danger of the model at the moment for me is that there's a tendency to try and recreate Whitehall in the regions rather than create, which I think what the report is advocating, a strong driver of productivity and infrastructure in each place, tailored and empowered to make that happen. And so that bit I really like. There are real risks around the planning stuff, and I'll leave that for the second bit of the discussion. But I think there's a danger that if people feel that things have been sucked up to that regional level and they're losing control of their ability to have a say on housing policy in their back garden and their backyard, that is a big risk for the mayoral model in the future. So I think you need to come up with something that's slightly different, which the report hints at. Then the third bit, the national bit, is the bit that I think gets away most lightly in this paper. And I do like the idea of Prime Minister, Chancellor-driven cabinet committee and tasking of all the ministers. I think it's an interesting innovation around the second chamber. I'd like to see, I don't think all the local authority leaders, I'd like to see some of the local authority leaders in there as well.
Which ones?
They could represent the counties,
as long
the
as
cities.
Leeds is there. It's
yeah,
okay.
Absolutely, yeah. But anyway, putting that to one side, the real issue is the culture of Whitehall, where even if you want to be a minister or a civil servant, in my view, and others have been ministers, so they can talk about this better than me, but what I observe is that staying in your lane and, not elbowing others out of the way is the right thing to do. Whereas every single issue that we're talking about here, whether it's inequality, whether it's climate change, whether it's economic growth and productivity, you can't stay in your lane. You've got to work with others. You've got to have much more collaboration. So I would like to see the values of the civil service change to represent having to know about and deliver for the whole country, having value for money, running right through what everybody does, because actually it's very different. The number of jobs have gone up in Whitehall, the number of jobs have gone massively down at a local level. And accountability structures where the vote of Parliament goes through the minister to the civil servant, and the worry about the Public Accounts Committee and where's my money going to be spent, and that element of control, which is of course an illusion of control a lot of the time, because people just get on and do things when there's 57 priorities at a local level occasionally, unless the Secretary of State tells me to do it, of course, then I would. But the point I'm trying to make is that the Whitehall system, as we see it, has got to take part of the blame for the 50 years. It's the one thing that has endured in exactly the same form through all of that time. And Whitehall, I'll finish, but Whitehall does manage to deal with every country in the world, but it doesn't manage to deal with every place in England, and that's got to change.
Thank you, Tom. Michael.
Well, I agree with almost everything in the paper, and it expresses what we've been trying to do far more succinctly than my own efforts in the Levelling Up White Paper. It manages to make the case with greater force, eloquence, and vigour in 57 pages than I managed in over 300. So I'd like to extend to the authors an opportunity to join the government. But why? Why has our progress been patchy and imperfect so far? So, measured against the paper. So first of all, devolution. My own personal view, we come to over time, not government policy, is yes, we should have mayoral combined authorities everywhere and unitary local authorities everywhere. That's the simplest and best and most efficient model. Why do I like mayoral combined authorities? Because, as the paper brings out, if you have a single identifiable person with a 4-year or whatever term and a clear mandate, and every mayor that's been elected has had at the centre of their mandate delivering economic growth and improving productivity in their area, then you get a far greater degree of accountability than has been the case with local government leaders in the past. There have been obviously great people who've been leading our great cities, so Richard Leese in Manchester and Jeremy Beecham in Newcastle and so on, but it makes a difference when you have a mayoral election, and it is a big figure like Andy Burnham, Andy Street, Steve Rotherham, or someone who's become a big figure like Ben Houchen pitching for that role. So why haven't we got that everywhere? Well, there are, and I'm straying into the second part of it, small p political objections. I remember when Eric Pickles was doing my job, great man. But one of the reasons that he always said whenever anyone came into his room and suggested reorganisation of local government, he took out a special pearl-handled revolver for them. One of the reasons for that is, A, time-consuming, but B, political parties need activists. And local councils are the key foot soldiers for every political party. So therefore, any reorganisation of local government that reduces the number of elected representatives strikes at the potential cadre of figures who will go out and deliver leaflets and secure for you as an MP and as a minister the re-election that you seek. So that's one reason for it. There's another reason as well. Some MPs, and it applies in all parties, don't like the idea of mayors in the same way as there are some MPs in Scotland and Wales who don't really like the idea of first ministers that much, because strong regional leaders eclipse their capacity to be the voice of Essex or the voice of the valleys or the voice of the Highlands or wherever it might be. And again, in terms of party management, any leader of any party is going to be a bit chary about having all of Essex or all of Wales in revolt to these proposals when they will need their votes for other, perhaps more contentious legislation. But that's the first thing. So that on structures, very much agree. That's one of the reasons why we haven't necessarily made the progress we want. One thing I would say, though, is that we do incentivise. It's not simply purely organic and bottom-up. We have something called gain share. A gain share means that, or implies, that when a mayoral combined authority is created, the improved productivity will benefit the Treasury, and so therefore we can give you some of it. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that a straightforward bribe from the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities to embrace the mayoral model, whichever way you look at it, it's certainly a way of greasing the wheel. I mean, I think that the gain share way of describing it is a little idealistic, but it's true. The bribe is how politics often works overall. On the single pot, I completely agree. And we're moving towards that. That's the essence of the Trailblazer deals that we've secured with Andy Street and Andy Burnham, that they do have more control of a single pot rather than having to leap through a variety of hoops for ring-fenced budgets. But two things. Every single Prime Minister, and indeed most Chancellors, like to have new single pots. So Prime Ministers might be keen on chess or on parks or on this or on that. And local government is an indispensable delivery partner. So we just need to recognise that we should make the perfect enemy of the good, but broadly a move towards single pots are right. Fiscal devolution overall, I completely agree with, and we've got business rates retention for a far longer period in the West Midlands and in Greater Manchester. In crude terms, that means that if Andy Street and Andy Burnham are, and they will be and have been, more successful in getting more business investment in their areas, they can keep more of the business rates for longer rather than have the Treasury take it away and centralise it. Problem, however, Manchester succeeds, Birmingham succeeds, the Treasury has less money it can take in order to redistribute to those areas which are poorer overall. And there is a problem if you have an area that has, for a host of reasons, difficulty in attracting business early on, and also, as is the case with many of the areas where we most want to see productivity improve, a council tax base based on properties which are Band A, Band B, and Band C. So it is simply the case that there is less money to draw on locally, and you need transfers, you need fiscal transfers of some kind in order to help. I should say that what the paper does very well is it also points out that those fiscal transfers shouldn't simply be welfare, they should also be investment in R&D. We're doing that. Are we doing enough? No, but we are doing it. And it should also be the case that you have easier access to capital and credit on a regional basis. This has been a big problem in this country since the 1930s. Transport, completely agree. Whatever you think of HS2, it is economically more rational to improve transport links between the cities of the north and within the cities of the north than straight from the north to the capital. Discussed. Would it be great to have both? Probably. But if you have to choose, and we did, then northern and Midlands and city transport. And also the point about densification. So important. One of the big problems with our cities is that they are extremely inefficient outside London, indeed in London, in the way in which they use land. So that means that, for example, Leeds has no mass transit system. I think 9 out of 10 people in Marseille can get from the periphery to the centre of the city in under half an hour, only 4 in 10 in the Leeds-Bradford area. So that's wasteful in terms of time. It's bad for productivity. It's bad for the environment. That's why we've been concentrating on supporting densification and brownfield development. But that takes me on to planning as well. The thing with planning, as we all know, classic, I'm sure I'll mispronounce this, Mansell-Olson problem. The gains are there for everyone who gets a new house, but they're not in the area at that point. The costs are for all the people who are living there now. So, of course, lots of different governments have tried to reform planning in lots of different ways. But that is the unbudgeable, that doesn't mean that you can't overcome it, but the unbudgeable political fact. One related thing about house prices is that, of course, supply constraints are a problem. But as the Tony Blair Institute and Josh Ryan Collins have pointed out, the financialisation of housing, big topic, particularly in London and the South East, has distorted access to the market for younger people. Skills, I completely agree. We are getting more students, those on trumpet, studying STEM subjects at GCSE and at A-level proportionately and in absolute terms than ever before. But when we talk about that, we have all sorts of people talking about the decline in creativity and pressures here and elsewhere. The key thing, as we all know, anyone who's been involved in education is that you need to make certain choices, and at certain points you will be unpopular for saying, do you know what, we are going to privilege science, technology, engineering and mathematics in the curriculum and in the allocation of resources to universities. Do we need to do more? Yes. I won't say too much about FE at the moment, but we can. On folk going to the Lords, fine. But my view is that Lords reform is something that obsesses people in SW1 and is irrelevant elsewhere. I know that's a cheap point, but I read Simon MacDonald's book recently, Leadership. He devotes almost 40 pages at the end of it to his plans on Lords reform. And I just think there is a shine of senescence when someone is so obsessed with that issue. Two more things. Altering the Green Book, absolutely. I owe one of my officials an enormous amount for pointing out to me that the Treasury score reducing the amount of time it takes to get from Surrey to Waterloo or Victoria Station by 30 seconds, higher in terms of value, cost-benefit ratio, PCR, higher than cutting the time to travel into Sunderland by 30 minutes. So it's crazy and needs to change. Final thing, the Prime Ministerial or political leader chaired committee board delivery group. Absolutely, and this is at the heart of it. You've got to have a Prime Minister who absolutely believes and is dedicated to this, because Prime Ministers have so much with which to deal that they can really only have at any given time about 3, maybe 4, strong domestic priorities. If we believe this is one, then great, but again, we have to choose, and we will have to acknowledge that some of the other issues that we might consider to be truly important will not secure the Prime Ministerial buy-in required. And again, one of the things is that sometimes, if you've got a strong Chancellor, if you've got a Gordon Brown or a George Osborne, or you have a strong alternative figure elsewhere in the government, if you've got a John Prescott or a Michael Heseltine, you can really drive these things through. But let's not let's not forget that the critical thing here is creating the political demand for action that any Prime Minister, whatever their temptations to look elsewhere, cannot resist. And that is why I think that the more that we can do to move towards the more widespread adoption of a mayoral model overall, the more any Prime Minister will not be able to resist doing what is required in order to close the gap.
And the interesting thing, Michael, we say from all the interviews is that in the Osborne-Brown period, part of the problem was the Prime Minister was not interested enough, and that the Chancellor alone does not have the, even if they're a big strong one, does not have the clout.
No, I agree.
Just one thing, on the fiscal devolution, because I agree with you about business rates, that isn't really, though, like big fiscal devolution. When we're talking about, like, about localising VAT or a local income tax, pretty much all of the people we spoke to said, no way. And because it's just too hard and too politically difficult, and also the inequity it throws up. So when you say fiscal devolution, yes, did you actually mean no?
No, I mean, I am in favour, and we have gone further, but these are baby steps.
Which is a good thing.
Yes, so there is further to go. But again, the move from rates to the community charge, as I still romantically think of it, poll tax, created such inequities and injustice that it was part of an ongoing process of meaning that the locally raised amount of tax diminished and diminished and diminished. And if we're going to increase it, then we need to think hard about dealing with some of the fundamental inequalities in our society that.
Cool. We're going to go out a second time and then get some questions. And I think we can overrun by 5 minutes because we start 5 minutes late. So, John, there are some things which we were involved in, contested at the time, which became consensual, like bank independence, independent statistics, actually the competition authorities, auto-enrolment in pensions. Some things get ripped up. So in terms of, what is it about this which means that it always seems to get ripped up at the end of every parliament, at the beginning of the next one? And is there any way, is this just because Whitehall is always going to be like this? Or is there anything you can do to try and give us a bit more stability in the way in which we make policy in this space?
Look, I don't know the answer to that question. No one's ever elected me to anything. My hunch is that the thing that will sort of get a bit of momentum into this will be some success stories. If it's actually clear that some of the elected mayors have managed to make a difference, and that is tricky because they are hemmed in on many fronts. But I just sort of implicit in the way you framed this is that the obstacles to this are sort of fundamentally political. And I just wanted to say, and this is not going to make anyone here, feel better. I actually think, as well as the large political obstacles to this, there are enormous financial and economic obstacles which we're sort of slightly ignoring. I mean, the fact I happen to go fairly frequently to Leipzig in the former DDR, and it's an astonishing place. The turnaround that has been achieved there in 30 years, which is not a very long time, is just mind-blowing. But what hits you between the eyes is what it took to make that happen. And the truth is that it was possible because you had the sheer wealth-creating machine and political willingness to reallocate resource from the West Germany to the former East. And of course, the former East was a lot smaller than the West. Now, we are just not in that situation. I mean, the British economy is not in great shape. It's not been in great shape for a long period of time now, and that has accumulated. And moreover, the public finances are not in great shape. And international, with my commercial hat, we do a lot of investing in cities around the country. We put £1 billion into the centre of Cardiff. No one else is going to put £1 billion into the centre of Cardiff. And the most depressing thing about this, I mean, for us, it's all good commercial stuff, is there's no one else to do it. And international investors, and I spend a lot of my time talking to international investors, have a very, very, very negative perception of this country and the potential of this country. And therefore, I'm merely making the point that we've not just got to turn around the politics of this if you want to make progress. We've got to find quite a lot of money from somewhere, and I think that's going to be a tall order right now.
Cool. Thank you. Rachel, you sort of said that you want to talk more about the politics, and you also sort of said you weren't quite sure about the comprehensiveness principle, that it should be to everywhere.
Yeah, so I suppose 3 challenges, I think. I don't see how you create the money to do serious redistribution unless you are willing to do something serious in your existing wealth-creating bit of England, which probably means the Oxford-Cambridge area. So my great hope is that an incoming Labour government is willing to concrete over Cambridgeshire, because a Conservative government certainly isn't. But that seems to me a prerequisite to any of this. But that wasn't actually, so I agree with that. It wasn't actually what I had in my mind about the politics. I suppose the first thing on the politics in the short term is you talk about the need for sort of more funding in R&D and transport. This is a zero-sum question. So it does mean that King's College is going to get less money. Are we fine with that? Because you're not getting your R&D spend anymore. And UCL is not getting its R&D spending anymore if you want it to go to Manchester or Leeds or areas in the north. And so I think there is a zero-sum question that we tend to elide. Much more than both of those, though, politically, in my view, the challenge is that almost everything we're talking about is basically irrelevant to the electorate. What do they vote on? It's not this. Okay, when they elect a government and it goes in, and the government turns around and says, my first priority of my 2 domestically is to force every bit of England into a mayoralty, when we just come out of, and just coming out of a massive cost of living crisis, people think public services are on their knees. Yes, they think transport's not working very well, but that's kind of actually even that's relatively minor in their scale of concerns. I don't think it would be very hard to mount a campaign saying this government's lost the plot. So I think, and actually I think you have a recommendation there we haven't really talked about. This has always been my view about this agenda, is that yes, you need to recognise that economic growth in the regions can only come from agglomerating major cities. And yes, you need to recognise that that in itself is implausible without major devolution and probably funding. But if you cannot convince people very rapidly that actually the fabric of their daily life is improving in these areas, and by rapidly I mean within a parliament, why the hell should they think this is a good use of your time and your effort and your money? I think the best hope in your paper and the most interesting area, I've always felt this, I'm not sure Michael agrees with this, it is what you call, I think, social infrastructure. It's broadly, what are the sets of things you can do within 1 year, 2 years, to make sure that people think, well, this means that the park's not full of needles anymore, and the high street looks better, and yes, fix the potholes, and yes, make sure there's a new GP surgery next to the train station in the centre of town, that persuades them that this isn't a totally abstract decision designed to create yet more politicians that they hate. I think that is the fundamental political problem.
Although if people think that, if they think that having stronger, more effective agglomerating economies is a good thing, cities.
I don't think people think that. I don't think they have a clue.
So if the government persuaded them that spending more money on science innovation was going to create more good jobs, there's quite a lot of places which, by the way, correlate with places which voted leave, outside the major conurbations, who, if you tell them, yeah, but we don't really care about the innovation, good jobs in your area because our focus is on the cities, then you make those divides worse. And I just kind of wonder where that, so to say you can never have an economic vision which makes any sense to people outside potholes is one thing, but that's a challenge. But the second thing which you're saying is, but you should only focus on the areas where it might make a big difference and ignore the other areas. Isn't that part of our problem?
Well, so I guess to extend that, what would you mean by putting R&D into a small town in Northern England? I think you could mean, and I think this would be very credible, that you continue to accelerate one of the few areas of political consensus. You do full expensing, you incentivise any company that is existing in that area to spend in R&D. That's completely credible. It's perfectly credible to say if there happens to be a large university which has real R&D intensity in a small town, I'm trying to think what that one would be, that you can pour more money into it. But I am not convinced that a realistic, credible, keep your promises story to the towns of England is we are going to revolutionise what your specific economy looks like. I think it's we make your town nicer and we make it better. We allow you to get into the city. We allow you to access good jobs. And that has the great benefit, it's now a whole other argument, I'm sorry, has a great benefit of being fast. And my main point was not so much about cities versus towns and the economic evidence. It's that I don't think you do this stuff that feels abstract and totally outside what people are actually voting on unless you have a very credible plan to do stuff that they do care about and fast.
I mean, it goes to a fundamental question, which is, are Burnley and Blackburn happier being excluded from being part of Greater Manchester, or would they rather be part of it? If they're happy to be excluded because they don't think it's working very well and it's a bit irrelevant for them, then fine. But if you're starting to win the argument that being part of successful agglomerated economies is a good thing, I'm using technical language, then being excluded becomes a political
But do they need
problem.
to be excluded? That's my latent demand point. I don't
Well,
care if it's a neat patchwork. I'm very happy for mayoralties to expand if they're successful and people like them. I don't care about imposing them on somewhere that doesn't want it.
Fair enough. Tom?
The Advanced Manufacturing Park is on the site of the Battle of Orgreave, and it is in Rotherham, and it's one of the best innovation facilities in the world. It brings together the metal cutting expertise of Sheffield University with Boeing, McLaren, and a brilliant set of local players. That was something that would not have happened if it was a Whitehall system. I was the accounting officer who signed off the first cheque for £10 million. It was a leap of faith. It was working with the university. It is possible to do this thing. Leeds and Manchester have been job generating engines. They have built as many houses as if the rest of the country built at that rate, we would hit our national target. So I think sometimes we miss the good things that have happened and can happen when you get the right alignment of local leadership and the public and the private sector, particularly with academia, really working together and sticking with it. The thing that I would lead with for the place, for this agenda, is the things that the places need most. So in London, I would make it absolutely about housing and affordable housing, and I would make sure that the policies that were a part of this were absolutely going to help deliver more quickly affordable housing in the capital, because that is the fundamental policy problem in this place that's different to we have housing issues in the rest of the country, but it's not as fierce and as white heat as it is in London. In the north, we have a joke that we don't have a productivity puzzle. Try getting around the north. It's about transport. Most people in the deprived communities don't own a car. The buses go through arterial routes, so people can't and are too expensive for them, so they can't afford to get to education or training or a job. So making a real difference on transport, giving us more control, would absolutely, I think, be something that would be popular. It's not just been not getting the transport investment, it's been that we've safeguarded 700 football pitches of land in the middle of Leeds to the outskirts, ready for a project that we didn't ask for, but we were asked to get behind. And, we don't want to get into that debate again about, HS2, but that is, we've still built, we planned our whole city around that. And basically Whitehall has meant that we've got to replan our whole city around something else. So, yeah, I think you lead with the things that will appeal to people and that they will intuitively say, of course we need better transport. Yeah, I'll go with that. Okay. Of course we need more affordable housing in London. We'll go for that.
Okay. Michael, I'm not saying there will be a political transition in the next election. We don't know what the result's going to be. But you and I went through a transition in 2010. And, there was this new department called Children's Schools and Families, and, it got ripped up and the name was changed. And a lot of the stuff was dismantled by a new Secretary of State who wanted to make his mark with a very different approach. Is the idea, it's a bit different now, because if you've been a cabinet minister, then you focus on legacy rather than change. But is it just for the birds, the idea that we could get to a set of institutional relationships which and a way forward which lasts beyond an election? Or is it just inevitable that when elections come, it all gets ripped up?
I don't think it is inevitable. And again, when I speak at a sort of case-by-case basis, so I remember our mutual friend Andrew Doan saying to me that the most important thing to do if you were in government is to create institutions. Institutions are more important than legislation. And by that he didn't just mean buildings, he meant things like, for example, Teach First. He didn't create it, but he was the sort of principal evangelist for it and helped it to grow. He did create institutions in academies, and he believed that they would be proof points of how a different approach towards education would work. He subsequently helped to champion the equivalent of Teach First in social work called Frontline. I believe that the mayoral combined authorities are institutions. The situation that was required by Labour in London to undo what they saw as the historic wrong done by getting rid of the GLA and the creation of a mayor opened the door to that. George Osborne, initially a wee bit sceptical about devolution, but then became an enthusiast for it. And now the success, of Andy Street, Andy Burnham, Ben Houchin and others, I think means that there will be almost no going back. And it has been striking that the East Midlands, which has, one has to be careful here, but the point was made earlier, the West Midlands, Birmingham in the centre, and then Black Country, Coventry and so on. East Midlands, three places of more or less equal significance, Derby, Nottingham, Leicester. The East Midlands turned its nose up at the idea of devolution, then having seen how successful it's been under Andy Street, and I'm sure it would have been equally successful under a very good Labour leader, but nevertheless, it has now overcome its reluctance, wants to go down that route. There will be mayoral elections later this year for the East Midlands.
Without Leicester?
Without Leicester. Leicester is the San Marino of the East Midlands, in that sense. But eventually it will come around, I'm sure. And I think that model will grow. And I think that, again, whether it was Lisa Nandy or Angela Rayner who was opposing me, and there were plenty of things that I was getting wrong and will get wrong and have got wrong, that they can make hay with, the overall analysis of the need to strengthen devolution, strengthen local institutions, think about how the centre could be held better to account in improving economic opportunity elsewhere was broadly right. And I remember when Lisa was doing the job, one of the points that she made, it was a critique, and it may have been a caricature of the Blair era. She said that her view of the Blair era was, let London and the South East go gangbusters. That will generate the growth, and then we will redistribute it elsewhere and help people to, through transfers, overcome the pain of deindustrialization. And she said that she felt that that was disempowering, and that what we needed was the strong local leadership, the sense of enterprise that she believed, and argues in her book, would be truly transformative and empowering. Because as a sort of blue Labour person, for her, the view was it wasn't just about equality. Belonging mattered just as much as did earning and the dignity of labour. Now, I don't want to put words into the mouth of any Labour figure now, but I do think that what Lisa was arguing for, more explicitly perhaps than many, has actually become slightly more embedded in the way in which people across the political spectrum look at our challenges now.
Very, very good. We're going to overrun very slightly, but let's just take one round of 3 or 4 questions, which we'll answer in one go. We'll take the gentleman there. Stand up and shout, because the microphones will come eventually. Go.
Sure. All right. Hello. I'm a Treasury official. My name's Alex, and I'd love to try and apologise for institutional weaknesses, but I've only worked.
There's actually, it's behind you.
Let me just check my question. What I was quite curious to ask really was, reflecting as a Treasury official, I think any future government will face significant reluctance from Whitehall. I think that's been covered by the panel already. And the Treasury, from my perspective, has been far more interested in opening an office in the north and sending some staff there, but still hasn't done anything about the Green Book, which, Minister, you spoke to. One of the things I thought, having read the report, maybe could have gone further about that point about the Cabinet Office Committee was the role of potentially a regional inequality duty that all civil servants have to consider in the same way they do net zero targets or public sector equalities, for example. But where this question is going is, I think there is an argument to argue at the election that is compelling to the electorate that, you know, Whitehall has failed. Whitehall is part of the problem, it's not part of the solution. But how do you create that compelling narrative then that shows what that will then do to the regions in a way that is compelling to them electorally? I guess my question to you is, how do you think the party should pitch that in a way that is electorally appealing?
Very cool. Pass your microphone to the guy in the next, fabulous moustache. Any hands there? I'll take the gentleman there and somebody over here.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Theodore. I'm a PhD researcher in France, but visiting the LSE right now. Something that has struck me today is we're not talking about the green transition at all, but the green transition has the ability to do 2 things. First, deal with the major problem of mankind, I think, like climate change, but also creating massive jobs, especially in those so-called left-behind territories, because the EU right now is investing a lot in the green transition, especially in the industries. And when you look at agroecology, renewable energy, building renovation, biogas production, everything that has to do with the green transition can create jobs locally, and especially in these territories that used to be quite industrial. Just an example, France, the north used to be very industrial. It became left behind in a way, and now it's becoming the new valley for battery in Europe. So that's creating jobs for people who think there was no job anymore. So I'm wondering why we're not discussing the green transition tonight.
Very good question. Gentleman there with the glasses. Just go for it, just go for it. Just address us. Oh, it's arrived, look.
Yes, it's a very laudable paper. Wouldn't disagree with lots of attempts, ideas there. Just wanted to get away from some of the nitty-gritty, trying to look at the overview of it. It just seems that you're trying to take on a lot of things at the same time that haven't been done perhaps because over 30 years or 20 years. Trying to look at central government, you're trying to change central government, you're trying to change local government. We know all these things had been looked at before, even the mayors have taken some time to institute over time. And I was just looking at your first year of Parliament, and I think in first year, you're going to have the national plan launched, and local people, local leaders will be picking up their the sort of things they want to develop, their pet projects, if you like, their projects. Just seems rather slightly messy in many ways.
Very, very cool. Gentleman there. Shut the microphone. Don't actually throw it. Just pass it.
Nicholas Beale. Sir John's surely absolutely right. We invest far too little in this country. We've underinvested for years and years. And this transformation which is needed cannot be done on the cheap without investment. Isn't part of the solution, therefore, to allow these authorities to borrow money from investment and keep the proceeds of the growth that's generated? Because if we leave this purely to the Treasury, with all due respect to Treasury officials in the audience, they will underinvest because they always do, every single time. There are institutional reasons why central government underinvests.
Cool. Blue jumper.
Hi, my name's Monica. I'm currently a class streamer in civil service, and I was wondering...
In which department?
Ministry of Justice.
Ministry of Justice. Good.
And my question today is, how could Brexit, the B word, I know it hasn't been mentioned yet, but I'm wondering how could Brexit offer an opportunity or a hindrance to these plans?
Very cool. So, 5 questions. You don't have to answer all of them. In fact, you can only choose one if you like, but we need to answer all of them. So there's a pressure as we go along. So you have, should there be a stronger inequality duty on the Treasury? What about the green transition? Is it really too ambitious to try and do this quickly? Should we go more slowly? Is fiscal devolution, actually, should that be about borrowing powers and stop Treasury controls on borrowing rather than the Green Book? And is Brexit a relevant factor? John?
I'd like to take our Whitehall officials, particularly Treasury officials, the problem. Look, it's perfectly true that there are strong centralising habits in Whitehall, and when we were doing the mayoral deals under Osborne, the toughest negotiations were in some cases with Whitehall departments, not with anyone out in the country. But the fact is, officials will do what strong ministers tell them. I don't think you need a legal duty. I think, Osborne managed to turn the Treasury into this devolving machine. I remember being sent to see Michael Heseltine, who had spent his lifetime fighting the Treasury for more devolution, and I was sent to explain that we'd now got religion, and he spent the whole time trying to work out how I was conning him.
But George Osborne didn't manage to persuade Michael to go over the education department, or actually, I'm not sure it was your department, to devolve post-16 apprenticeship funding and wider skills funding. So, there were constraints upon the Osborne sway, as is well documented.
At that time, it was Vince.
I thought that would be the answer. I knew it's those Liberal Democrats. Fine. Rachel.
I think that's an important point. Do we think that apprenticeship funding shouldn't sit with employers? And we should take it away from employers and give it to local authorities? That's quite an interesting devolution.
The thing which we say in the paper is that the framework of that should be discussed and negotiated with employers, not at the national level, but at the sub-regional level.
But at the moment, it's individual, right? You get to choose what you spend your apprenticeship money on, if it's an apprenticeship. Sorry, I'm diverting from the main questions, but I think there is an important point, which is that we are assuming that the devolved level is local government, and actually it's perfectly credible the devolved level is an individual company, a person, a school, or an institution. We haven't really discussed that. I should take the green transition. because your paper does talk about the green transition as one of the core ways to do it. I think the challenge is that this is already a deeply politically contested area in which it's very unclear how much the next government would be willing to invest and precisely in what, and what the comparative advantage of the different things they would invest in are. But I would fully expect that Whitehall will have an industrial strategy for the green transition, and they will create incentives for it, and they will create plans around it. It's not at all clear to me how much they will allow local areas to decide exactly what it looks like. But I think Ben Houchin is a good example of what a difference that kind of local energy makes.
Just on the green transition, I think there's a real place element to a lot of the opportunities that you mentioned. So, you know, the North basically kept the lights on in London over the years. You know, we're part of the energy industry of the country, and it really can be the green answer for the country as well, with you know, offshore wind in the Humber and up the to the northeast, and the nuclear capability in the northwest, and the opportunities of the transition through carbon capture and hydrogen as well. So I think all of that is a point really well made, and I think there is a spatial element to that, and I think the idea of these regional, the mayoral plans on infrastructure, I think that's where the net zero thing could really make a difference and bite, and you know, a lot of the infrastructure questions about energy production and distribution need to be sorted out at that level as well, and delivered locally. I just wanted to cover the question about Whitehall as well. I don't think it is enough, John, to rely just on the ministers. I do think there's something cultural about Whitehall civil servants having it written into the whole culture of the way of working, that they need to know about the whole country more and how to deliver things more. And I've never come across a civil servant who's been obstructing things for the sake of it. I think they're operating in a system that's really wastes too much energy and brain power, and there's brilliant people in the civil service. It's just how do we galvanise them for a collective effort that I mentioned before, rather than anything else.
So, Michael, you've got to do, I'm afraid, borrowing powers for local government. Is it too ambitious, and Brexit?
Okay. So
again,
yes. So on the first one, on the Treasury, everyone's right. Don't blame Treasury civil servants. It is a matter of ministers. But I do have some sympathy for the Treasury point of view, because the Treasury is the Craig Revel Horwood of government. Ed knows what I mean. They've seen it all before. You know, I've got this brilliant new plan to spend, to save. If you give me £5 billion now, then over the course of the next 20 years, there'll be so many savings and increased well-being. Yeah, absolutely.
It will all be a disaster, darling.
Exactly. So I understand that. The other thing is that there are already too many duties and placed on government. We actually have a series of missions in the Levelling Up white paper. We haven't perhaps done enough to put them up in lights. There may be an argument that, as ever, if government changes, that while they might change the nature of missions, they should keep those missions, i.e. keep a mission on housing, keep a mission on education, keep a mission on adult skills and so on. But that yeah, bad for debate. Green transition, everyone else has made the point. On the ground, yes. So if you see what Ben Houchin is doing, if you see what's happening on East Yorkshire and the Humber, if you see what the economic activity is that Jamie Driscoll wants to see driven in the northeast, it is so much around a gigafactory in Blythe, or making sure that Teesside continues to have the investment in offshore wind assembly and manufacture that it has. So absolutely, for a variety of reasons. On Nicholas Beale's point about investment, again, I can understand why not just Treasury, but all of us are a bit scarred about local government borrowing. So we have a situation in Woking, we have a situation in Slough, and we have a situation in a number of local authorities, all micro examples, where the local authorities borrowed in order to invest, in order to save. And they often borrowed in a way that was ambitious, but has landed local people in a terrible mess. So I think the bigger problem in terms of investment in this country is the bias that so many institutions show, and we as individuals show, for investing in property. We need to change the incentives, whether that's through the tax system or other things. But one of our biggest problems as a country is that we are rentiers rather than venture capitalists as a nation. On Brexit, well, we could change some of that. We could change some of the incentives for financial services and institutions in the way they invest. And at a local level, we could go further on altering procurement principles. It might be the case that that would militate against efficiency, but it could be the case that you could have a more local procurement model. But discuss. I mean, I'm more than happy to talk about Brexit, and I suspect I'll have to spend the rest of my life, however long or short it is, talking about it in all its different dimensions. So maybe I could come back and talk just about that one day if you want. Final thing, on skills. Germany has a lot to teach us, as everyone points out, but there are two things about Germany that people don't necessarily like or might prove unpopular. The first thing is that the physical establishments, the FE colleges in Germany, tend to be owned by businesses, and they tend to be funded directly by those businesses. If we were going to have a model here, it would in effect be a new tax, a new business tax for skills. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. The apprenticeship levy was a move in that direction. The second thing is that if you're an economic liberal, you won't like the fact that in Germany they have a guild structure, which means that if someone comes to repair your plumbing and you don't like it, you ring up the Guild of Plumbers and you say, you talk to the local Meister in charge of it, and you say, Fred has just done a completely terrible job here. They investigate, and if Fred has done a terrible job, that's it. Plumber no more. Now, the standard, sort of Liz Truss economic liberal view of the world is that there are too many licenses over what people can and can't do, and that leads to a stickier labour market and all the rest of it. Absolutely correct. But one of the ways in which you can ensure that you get investment in skills is if you have a guild system and if you have licensing like that. Discuss. Final point, Vince Cable. Why was Vince Cable in charge of post-16 education in the coalition?
Gordon Brown.
Two things. Firstly, well, actually Peter Mandelson. When Peter Mandelson came in to be First Secretary of State and all the rest of it, he wasn't content with the existing department. He said, I'm going to take over the business department, okay. But this new dinky department you've got in charge of universities, innovation and science, I want that too.
He did.
But
Gordon Brown gave in to him.
And Gordon Brown said, oh, okay, yeah, package. John Denham, go off somewhere else. Okay, big package.
That's right.
Peter, you are, the most important person in Whitehall.
The first Secretary of State.
First Secretary of State. Okay. Labour loses, or at least doesn't win, 2010 election. Coalition negotiations. The business department was the major economic ask for the Liberal Democrats. Fine. I said to George, we can't possibly give the Liberals control over skills and universities. It's in our manifesto that we're going to have an education department that will take back, and we'll the fissure that Gordon Brown was responsible for, we will heal. And he said, you've got so much to learn. Firstly, Vince is at least as vain as Peter Mandelson. And there is no way that he will accept a department any less expansive than Peter's. And the second thing he said is, Michael, we are committed to introducing something called tuition fees. The Liberal Democrats are opposed to tuition fees. The department that will introduce tuition fees is headed by a Liberal Democrat. This will result in political perdition for them and success for us. Now, do you really want... I said, fine, George. You're the master. And that's why I wasn't responsible.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've slightly overrun, and we're going to go up to have a drink now. Just in conclusion, it was absolutely true that we decided to write a paper, not about what we would ideally do, a blueprint, but what did we actually think was deliverable in a parliament and in two parliaments. And the answer to the gentleman's question there is, it is. And I think totally agree with Michael that if you have the opportunity where something starts to become embedded in a cross-party way, you grab it and run with it. And that wasn't the case with children's schools and families back in in 2010. And then you have to then decide which are the bits where you're going to be radical and which are the bits where actually it's just not going to work. I mean, there is no way we'll have radical tax devolution in our country in the next parliament. And therefore putting it on the table just wasn't part of our, what we thought was a deliverable sell. It doesn't mean you can't have step-by-step change. Secondly, you won't have a devolved industrial policy. But it won't work if it's a centralised industrial policy. And the really hard thing in this is finding a way in which you can actually have both central leadership and a local shaping and delivery. And that is hard and will depend very much upon the quality of the people. We made a decision, and this is, I think, thinking about if there was a Labour government, there is no way you'll do this if it's only for some places. I mean, it will be for a Labour government, unless you can say your ambition is for all, it will never happen.
Yeah.
And by the way, Rachel is totally right. If your ambition is incomprehensible and doesn't make any sense in terms of growth and jobs, it won't happen either. That is like a prior thing. But if it's real and positive, it's got to be comprehensive. That may not be true for the reasons Michael said about a Conservative government, but I think for a Labour government it would be. And then, if you're going to make it work, you actually have to give unblocking clout powers to the combined authority around transport and planning. And I don't think that means you have to hand over to them individual housing numbers, but it has to be a galvanising. That is very controversial. And then it won't happen unless you do something about resource. And I don't think it's going to be solved by borrowing. It's going to, and it won't simply become by redistribution. It will come from deciding that these things are priorities, which are things you have to do to get to growth. And that is a hard argument to make at a time of fiscal challenge. So I think that critique of the paper, we didn't set out a fiscal envelope because we didn't think that was kind of our role. But that is a big, big challenge. But it was deliberately done thinking, could this be implemented, whether you have a Labour or a Conservative government after the next election, or, God forbid, the Liberals back with it's so interesting hearing Michael speak. I mean, if you're respectful, you call them the Liberal Democrats. But if you've served in government with them, you call them the Liberals. And that's what he was doing. But thank you very much indeed to John Kingman from the Treasury and from Rachel Wolfe, a manifesto writer, Tom Reardon, Chief Executive of Leeds City Council. Goodness knows what his next job will be. To Alice McGovern, who did all the work and then couldn't get here because of votes. And Michael Gove, who's clearly off the whip tonight, the Secretary of State for levelling up, for being such a great panellist. And to my co-authors, Nyasha, Esme, Dan and Anna, and to King's, the Strand Group, Harvard, Gatsby, and all of you for coming along and come and have a drink with us now. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the panel.